This is episode 311 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Well, Wally, more earth shattering news this week here in the land of enchantment. And we'll start off with the big news coming from our governor that New Mexico, while it did not quite achieve the 60% vaccination rate that she was going for, she's decided to quote unquote fully reopen New Mexico anyway on July 1st.
Yes, two comments. Missed it by that much, but I guess that doesn't matter. Close doesn't matter in COVID vaccination statistics, horseshoes and hand grenades. And then, yeah, there is some interesting. We're open, and those buts are not insignificant right now in terms of some things that are not back to normal. And no pun intended with use. That is
Those butts are not
the
insignificant.
the butt, B-U-T, the one T butt.
Just kidding, Wally. Gotta get my jokes in while I can.
You got me.
It is just another instance of our governor kind of doing what she was going to do anyway. And as they have in recent months, as things have, generally speaking, moved in a much better direction with regard to the virus, its spread, et cetera, the vaccinations, of course, the governor has put her thumb on the scale of going and reopening things, which is good. The issue that looms largest out there for me, especially as the parent of three young children who I'm not going to get vaccinated, we'll just say that, is the issue of masks and athletics and activities. As we speak right now, they are at a summer camp. It does happen to be indoors, but regardless, masks on young kids whose survival rate for the COVID-19 is in the 99.999, and so forth out into ad infinitum. But of course, looking down the road to school and other states like New Mexico that remain mask requirement states, there aren't a whole lot of other things that the governor is going to hold back on, to my knowledge, with regard to reopening New Mexico, but that is a very big one, Wally. So it is good that we're reopening, but just like everything else in this whole situation, this whole crisis, things are not as they seem.
Yeah, and Paul, as I look at these masks, it's looking like the places that had earlier and more stringent mask mandates didn't do any better than places that were very strict with regard to that. And I have a theory, and I'm starting to see a few studies come out about this, and I guess we'll probably know the answer from a more thorough scientific point of view, probably 3, 5, 7 years from now. But one of the issues is that you have reduced oxygen level, increased carbon dioxide level in the air you breathe with a mask, and then there's more and more thought that bacteria that is already naturally occurring and that you come in contact to is kind of recirculated. So there is no free lunch. And one thing I found personally, and really a Wally Drangmeister sample of one, does not qualify as science. But, I think that when I've worn masks, I felt like I'd had more congestion, more inflammation. And anytime you add congestion and inflammation to your system, it's a remedy for getting more infections, whether it be COVID or something else. So, yes, I'm not sure this is all there. And, like the Thomas Sowell book that dealt with this issue, there is nothing that's a pure benefit. There are trade-offs here. And so, this last one, I have a feeling it's going to die hard. Not the movie, but difficult to get rid of, because I think it has got to be, despite everyone's protestations that it's not political, these masks have gotten to be very, very political, and a lot of people have a very strong affinity for them. And it seems like the governor is one of those who does.
Yeah, and If you go on Burbio, burbio.com, they have a school mask policy tracker. Uh, and the states that have a mask requirement in place are the usual suspects, the very deep blue states, the left coast, Minnesota, Illinois, New York, Virginia. Now that's been a recent phenomenon in them being a blue state, but North Carolina, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island. Uh, States surrounding New Mexico, not surprisingly, are either in the no mask mandate, and that includes, yes, blue Colorado. School districts have flexibility on requiring masks. Arizona, which is in the same boat, but Utah, Oklahoma, and Texas all have outright bans on mask mandates. So not only can school districts
They have no
not they
choice.
have
No
no
mask.
choice. No mas, no mass. Very very nicely works together. So that's just the counterpoint to the complete reopening of New Mexico. And of course, we are happy as anybody to see New Mexico finally starting to really reopen. Of course, we're not out of the emergency orders yet, et cetera, et cetera. Now, with you could argue that this is in many ways the final nail in the coffin of the COVID-19 situation here in New
2 weeks
Mexico.
to flatten the curve, and
Yes, 15 months is where we wound up. Uh, it's time to really take a look, though, at Governor Lujan Grisham's performance. And we didn't necessarily come up with the metrics, but a group called the Smile Project. Smile, of course, means you're not wearing a mask because you can be seen smiling. They used a few data points, uh, notably deaths per capita. So if your state really did well in keeping people alive, that was one of the data points. Your unemployment, and specifically how much employment people lost during the pandemic. And you'll see in a minute that New Mexico uh, performed poorly before COVID and performed poorly throughout COVID and is still performing poorly on unemployment. And then classroom time lost, which I think is a very important uh, issue within the COVID parameters. And by this organization's ratings, the Smile Project puts New Mexico overall at the seventh worst performance on COVID 19. New York, Nevada, Illinois, California, New Jersey, and Massachusetts were the worst performing states according to this index. Those are all deep blue states. Deep blue states, usually with pretty high death rates uh, and very weak economic recoveries, mass mandates, and the whole 9 yards as well. Now, we looked at some of the numbers and found Worldometers. That's the place I go for my COVID, death data, death per population data. New Mexico's 13th highest. We had the third highest unemployment rate as of April 2021. But according to, let's see, it's not 24/7 Wall Street, but Wallet Hub, that's the one. They had a rating of the states and their recoveries since COVID-19, and New Mexico is in the bottom five on that one as well. And according to, yet again, Burbio, New Mexico has seen the sixth most time lost in the classroom in their report on that issue. So how much time did our kids have to do virtual learning and not have an option to be in the classroom? And for New Mexican students, it was about a year. So
yeah, and Paul, and in addition, and I don't know
mhm.
the fine points of the study, but in addition to losing classroom time, New Mexico had to be pretty far up there in learning, even distance learning, because are such a low penetration of high speed or even any speed internet access, which is necessary to do a remote learning protocol.
Yeah, no, very good points. And it is, of course, worth noting that the governor did a relatively good job on vaccine distribution. We are not fans of the lotteries or the briberies or whatever other kind of, and of course, the lotteries and the bribes, and by bribes I mean, we'll pay you $100 to get a vaccine, are just the velvet enclosed hand of the much firmer hand being taken with our children, and that we're also taken with New Mexicans until the CDC came out with its latest, decision that they suddenly weren't going to require people, quote unquote, who'd been vaccinated to wear masks, which is a giant loophole big enough to drive a semi truck through. So, kids, of course, if they are of a certain youthful age and appearance, really you can't, uh, you know, show or try to fake that they have been vaccinated, and it's a huge battle that is shaping up for, well, not just the rest of the summer, but into the fall, in terms of whether this governor is going to try to force our kids back into the classroom with masks on. And it's definitely something I think a lot of people are going to be up in arms about, as rightly perceived this pandemic recedes into the past.
So I know you didn't ask for it, but I predict yes. I think that from what I've seen, I'm not hoping for yes. I think that it's
That
not the right.
yes, the kids will be in this classroom, or that the governor will figure out a way to
Keep them. They'll be in the classroom, but there'll be masks on them in the
okay.
public schools. So that's just from the way things are going, and just reading between the lines of these recent discussions about the health orders coming out of Santa Fe.
Well, that would not surprise me. And as a family that has two children in uh, Catholic school, it'll be interesting to see what their approach is. Don't get me started on the Catholic Church and its approach to COVID-19. I'll just leave that here. But they're new to the school that they will be attending, and we're going to save judgment until that happens. But one is going to a charter school, and as they are government schools, ultimately, uh, that's going to be an issue we face as a family and as young people. Now, this dovetails right into a article that PED Secretary, Public Education Department Secretary Ryan Stewart, wrote in the Albuquerque Journal in an opinion piece that, boy, I may not be a fan of Lujan Grisham and her policies. I kind of had a soft spot for Stewart because he was a little better on issues like school choice than the governor. Hasn't done anything to push for that, but he seems like a well-intended man who has some experience in Philadelphia, where he lived for much of the pandemic, by the way. But this article appeared in the Albuquerque Journal. Schools proved they can do it in a historic year. Now, he may not have written that headline. Heaven help me. I hope he did not write that headline. In a disastrous year, in a frustrating year, challenging year, historic year, yes. When people say historic, they typically mean, Jackie Robinson historic, not Adolf Hitler historic. Like, you don't say that Adolf Hitler. He was so historic. I mean, yes,
he
he
was.
was a historic figure. He was man's time of the year, Times Man of the Year. But nobody says that. Historic tends to be something that is often a pretty good thing, and this was not a good year. So, slap on the wrist to the Albuquerque Journal's headline writer, but slap on the wrist for Ryan Stewart, who focused his entire piece on COVID and teachers and their safety. Which, let's face it, there is rampant, ample data. Emily Oster, writing in The Atlantic back in October of 2020, really did the seminal work for this, saying that schools are not super spreaders. Now, children are very safe, and this is one of the frustrating things about their being continued to be wearing masks by the governor and other policymakers. But in general, uh, this was not a good year for New Mexico children, whether you're talking about their mental health or also their academic performance. We don't have a lot of details because we don't have a lot of testing data and ways to actually, transparency is lacking. Let's put it that way. And yet Ryan Stewart is saying, we did a great job this year. Now, I disagree strongly, and I'm amazed at the delusional capacity of the human mind, including Secretary Ryan Stewart's in this case.
Well, it's interesting. I'm not sure I ever knew what historic meant. It's one of those words like fair or equitable. It means anything you want it to mean, but it's like famous or important in history or potentially so. So, was this historic? Yeah, it could be potentially disastrous for the long term academic achievement of New Mexico's children. Was it historic that they made it out alive the other side? I guess at some level, but we all did that. You have no choice, you know. Uh, but yeah, there were problems with education before COVID-19 reared its ugly head, and will be problems with education after. And it'll be interesting to see what the approach is. So it's nice to know that no matter how bad of a job you do, if you get a good op-ed, you can pat yourself on the back here in New Mexico, and we still have that outlet largely. Although, if you pat yourself on the back in the wrong way, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube won't accept it. But the Albuquerque Journal will let anyone make their case, evidently, and good for them for that, by the way. So,
Yeah, yeah, and it is an open forum. It just you expect a little more self introspection by the powers that be on the real challenges of COVID-19 and the lost school year. Yes, it's great that teachers remain safe, but that classroom, that system is supposed to serve the students, and yes, some teachers, although I haven't seen a single data point saying that a teacher anywhere in the country contracted COVID 19 in the classroom and wound up dying from that particular disease. So let's be real about how much or how little of a threat this illness actually was, let alone to the students. And I'm all for old, elderly teachers, teachers with specific health issues, having some flexibility during a challenging year. But again, according to Burbio, according to their school reentry tracker, New Mexico students already ranked 50th before the pandemic, lost more school time than all but five other states. Again, these are the who's who. The California's worst overall performance. Oregon, no shock there. Maryland, Washington, Hawaii. So actually six. So five other states were worse than New Mexico. We were sixth. And for this not to have permanent ramifications down the road, lasting ramifications at least, maybe not permanent, is an indicator that well, I think it's going to have those serious ramifications. If it doesn't, it's going to be an indicator that we're spending an awful lot of money for a product that seems awfully dubious. And it is notable that a lot of families did vote with their feet, like the Guessing family, and pulled our children out of the public schools, and they're not coming back. And that's a sign that you have a product that's not exactly blowing it out of the hitting it out of the park when people have a product not free but one that they are already forced to pay for that they are turning down because of its many problems.
yeah, and then Paul, the other issue that we have, it's the 1-2 punch to the negative is that when you're down in the lower echelons of poverty, it's very difficult. Homelessness is a problem. Having enough food, medical care, and those things are not positively correlated with receiving a good education. So, yeah, I think that we are indeed in an historic point, but the point is that where are we really with regard to these things, and what's our reaction as a state going to be coming out of this?
Yeah, yet another regressive aspect of this uh, policy of COVID and this time. If Republicans or conservatives enacted a policy that hurt the poor the way COVID-19 is and the governor's lockdowns is going to hurt the poor, that would be a political issue right in people's minds first and foremost. But you're right; it's the kids who live, especially impoverished kids who live out in the country, out in rural areas. They probably lost the most. They probably have parents who either don't have the skills or the time to help them learn, whereas a lot of more educated, wealthier parents not only have the technology capabilities, but have access to the internet and have the flexibility in their work schedules in order to help their children. So I suspect you had a lot of kids just more or less watching movies and sitting around the house playing video games during much of the pandemic when they could have or should have been in the classroom, but for policies out of Santa Fe. And again, those folks and others who vote in elections, they need to vote based on those issues and concerns. The pandemic was not treated the same way across our country and across the world. In fact, other countries, European countries in particular, but more conservative states kept the classrooms open and kept teachers and those kids together and undoubtedly had a better result educationally. And I'll just say it, Burbio, Wyoming, Arkansas, Florida, South Dakota, and Utah were the top five in performance on keeping kids in the classroom. So no surprise there based on previous discussions. Uh, Now, this is what leads me to believe that you are correct in your previous point about the 12-year-old threshold and the kids, which, by the way, the World Health Organization said that they don't recommend vaccinating young
Mhm.
people less than 18 years of age. So there's all kinds of these
Right.
recommendations coming out, the CDC, the WHO. And I'm not saying one's right or the other's right, but uh, I got an email straight from the Biden Department of Education that said that they're recruiting kids 12 years old and older across the country to make sure that they are all vaccinated before those kids go back to school. And they actually have set up a COVID-19 student corps, a program within the COVID-19 community corps specifically focused on students, in which these young people will be on biweekly calls to learn best practices and hear from, this is literally from the email, and hear from other students how they are talking to their friends, family, and other community members about getting the vaccine, fact sheets on vaccine safety and hints for planning and attending community events, social media content to share with your followers, and regular email updates with the latest vaccine news and resources to share. So if you're 12-year-old suddenly breaks into a very lengthy dissertation on the importance of getting vaccinated, perhaps it's because they've been getting propagandized by the Biden administration. This is scary stuff, Wally.
Yeah, it really is scary stuff because Paul, I'm a double Pfizer vaccinated person here, and for what it's worth, I'm slightly older than 59 and slightly younger than 61. And so I worry about, 10, 20-year, 25-year in the future side effects from this. It was clear to me that 90, 80, 70, 60, they probably should get the vaccine. Any risk of problems from the vaccine was probably more than compensated for in terms of risk of complications, including death. But as you get into those lower age, particularly when we don't know what the long-term effects of a vaccine is, to be vaccinating children, that are 12 years old, yeah, could that prevent them from getting COVID? Absolutely. But could the vaccine itself have long term consequences? And when you're 12, your normal life expectancy is a lot longer than mine is. And so, yeah, it's not clear to me that this is an absolute good thing to do at this point. And yes, it's frightening. I can't describe the core of children that this resembles in my mind historically without getting banned on YouTube. But there are a couple that come to mind in terms of a couple of different countries and a couple of different things that happen. But no, I don't think this is good. The other thing I've seen is in some countries, there's talk of somewhat how things are with reproductive health issues, allowing children to bypass their parents and be able to get this directly without doing that. I've not seen that in the United States. I want to be perfectly clear. But people who really like the vaccine and really think that everyone ought to have it regardless have gone to great lengths to make that happen. And it will be interesting to see how that unfolds here in the United States.
Very, very true. All right. Well, changing pace. And yes, I know we at one time had fantasies that somehow we weren't going to be talking about COVID every week. Someday we will stop talking about COVID, but that's only when the governor totally relinquishes her power over us. And she shows no signs of really doing that, unfortunately. Uh, it is related to COVID, and that is downtown Albuquerque, which of course is the site of the Rio Grande Foundation's offices, which means that, especially now that life, such as it is, slowly returns to the beleaguered downtown of our fair city here, uh, you noticed you notice things happening or not happening, and I noticed the other day in my walk around Albuquerque that the Hyatt, the sister building, if you will, of the tallest building in New Mexico, so right there adjacent to it, had been totally shut down. And it just happened that my starting to ask some questions coincided with an Albuquerque Journal article on the issue, uh, which answered some questions. I had no luck in getting uh, information out of Heritage Hotels, which owns the Hyatt downtown. So here's the scoop. Basically, the downtown Hyatt relies heavily on convention center business. It's right there across from the convention center. Conventions have been non-existent throughout COVID. Uh, they're going to reopen on September the 1st. That's the plan. However, the owner of the hotel, and there's other hotels in this boat, they have significant tax liens against these properties for non-payment of lodger's tax. Now, lodger's tax is a related issue, which we've talked about on this show, and it's a tax that theoretically is supported by the hospitality industry. Hotels charge their people staying the night, their customers, for staying in the hotel rooms, and then that money is taxed, sent to the city, and they use it for advertisements and other inducements to get people to come here, including not the least of which are convention centers, which of course uh, the Hyatt downtown gets a lot of that business. Now that's not a policy that Rio Grande Foundation likes very much. We think the money's been misused in the past. The claim made in the Albuquerque Journal article is that the hotel and hotels owned by Heritage, and I'm not saying this is just them, the claim was made that they had been collecting the tax and not remitting it to the city, which
Mm-hmm.
definitely is a problem if you're collecting a tax and not sending it over to the government. But this could set up a fascinating A, legal conflict, and B, philosophical discussion about the lodgers taxes and whether they're really a great idea. Because if the owner of Heritage Hotels decides to take a stand here, it would be a great conversation, and he would definitely be in a position to do that. So, you start digging, and it turns into an episode of Scooby Doo, and you wind up with those meddling kids en masse. Well, I got to be a meddling kid for once, just asking questions about a hotel that was clearly closed in the heart of downtown Albuquerque.
Yeah, this is a very interesting issue, and industry after industry has gotten basically payment plans and forgiveness and a whole host of other benefits, but it does not look like that extended to Albuquerque's lodgers tax. And so it will be interesting to see whether this is part of general financial weakness on the part of the lodging industry in New Mexico, or whether this is kind of a isolated incidents with regard to either one owner or a few owners, and something to not go the other that won't go further, I guess is the way to put it. Yeah, it's interesting, these lodgers tax, where they are largely purported to be supported by the industry, and they certainly must have been when they were passed, because they were passed a long time ago. But yeah, they're very interesting. And as you rightly point out there's some controversy, particularly in New Mexico, not necessarily using it to advertise in other places, using those funds, as I recall, for things like what a skate park or
Isotopes
yeah,
Park.
yeah, soccer fields,
Yeah.
other things like that. So yes, if you're a hotelier, I'm not sure that you necessarily see the full value for your money with regard to that tax that you are collecting.
Yeah. Now, uh, a bit of good news, and arguably in a week that wasn't so dang busy, this would have been 1A out of the chute there, Wally, because some really good news for the state of New Mexico. Unfortunately, our particular Attorney General, Hector Balderas, had nothing to do with this development, but a federal judge, rightly, in my opinion, ruled that the Biden administration cannot simply prohibit new leases on federal lands across the nation. That is a policy that had already been impacting New Mexico, but had real potential to dramatically impact the land of enchantment and its budget. Of course, we talked about the letter from the 24 quote unquote progressive legislators who are pleased or were pleased with the moratorium. Uh, People like Martin Heinrich and Ben Ray Lujan were firmly on board. Of course, Deb Haaland, fully supportive as well. A lot of our left leaning political establishment did support it. Not the governor, to her credit, and we ripped the governor on this show a lot, but she did not jump on board with the ban, nor did leadership in the House and Senate here in New Mexico. But uh, my blog posting, as I wrote it up on Errors of Enchantment, was: did a judge just unleash a new era of energy prosperity in New Mexico? And prices of a barrel of oil are up over $70. We're coming out of COVID-19. State revenues were already jumping by $350 million, thanks largely to oil and gas. Uh,
Drilling rigs, 75 of them
yep.
up from a few weeks ago when they hit 70. So yes, things are moving forward. And it's interesting, Paul, I can see this being like in the Bill Richardson administration, where he benefited primarily back then from natural gas while doing a lot to hinder the industry.
Mm-hmm.
I think the same thing might be setting up for Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's administration. She can be hard on the industry, but the pain may not happen until well after she's out of office. So
Yeah. And we don't know whether there will be an appeal from the Biden administration and Deb Haaland or
and
not.
what the result of it will be if
Right.
there is. So
And whether they, in what I said, they should, I thought they strategically should probably have done in the first place was to slow roll permits and just kind of make the industry really work hard to get new permits. Of course, that doesn't get you the front page headlines from the environmental groups, but now they could theoretically have their cake and eat it too. They can say, well, we tried, we gave them the old college try. Look at all these other amazing things we're doing to ruin the economy and get rid of oil and gas and carbon emissions. But uh, uh, this is potentially a very big deal for New Mexico. We had already been creeping up on North Dakota for second best in terms of, or second most in terms of oil production in the United States among the states. Only Texas leads us, and it's not really close. Texas is a juggernaut among oil producing states. So we've got a ways to go before catching Texas, but who knows? Aim high. The fact is that New Mexico's industry, in part due to the findings, geological formations, et cetera, had been booming. It was put on hiatus by COVID-19, but between the elimination of this threat with the permitting on federal lands, the economy going gangbusters, relatively speaking, like I said, this could be a huge benefit to New Mexico's bottom line.
yeah, absolutely could. And then in terms of being number two. Operating drilling rigs are a view of future production, and New Mexico has 75 of them, as I said a few minutes ago. North Dakota has 17. So it looks like as things stand today, if these trends hold, that New Mexico could get into that number two spot in the not too distant future.
Yeah, and last issue to discuss, ironically, this is the way Governor Lujan Grisham has played it with regard to energy. She has tried to look like she is adhering to the environmental group's whims by adopting many of their policies, so long as they don't directly impact the industry and the money that they put into New Mexico's economy. She literally is trying to have her cake and eat it too. Uh, in this way, she has said that in the January legislative session, 30 days in length, which she controls the agenda for, she wants to put a clean fuel standard on the call. That means that on the agenda, uh, I was quoted in the Santa Fe New Mexican and wrote about or talked about the potential harms of this policy. Oregon has already seen uh, significant gas price increases. And the real kicker here, Wally, is that as with so many so called environmental policies, the benefits are going to be minuscule, if at all. Ethanol has been in gas tanks for years, and now even environmental groups say, ethanol, not really a great idea. So this seems just like a really bizarre and ridiculous policy, but it's just one of many we've seen.
Yeah, and I was looking at this because this was raised this last session. It did not
Right.
obviously pass, but I was doing some analysis on it, and there's various estimates of what the increase in the price of a gallon of gasoline would be, and it could frankly be higher than the average estimates because New Mexico is a small place, and if you need specially formulated gasoline and your refineries are not producing a lot of that at scale, it could be a lot higher prices again at minimal or nominal, or in some cases no environmental benefit. So
Yeah, and what we have to go by is, of course, the legislation that failed in the 60-day session. Uh, they attempt to have whatever flexibility for business to address the issue in some innovative ways. Of course, remember switchgrass, Wally?
yes.
George W. Bush, I believe, was an energy bill coming out of his administration, which was supposed to be,
Mhm.
green and moving beyond ethanol, which switchgrass never became a thing. And the renewable fuel standard, I think, has either been repealed or defanged because the technology has not been there for other materials besides ethanol. It's been attempted for years and years to try to use something besides ethanol. Of course, ethanol, you require massive growth of corn in the Midwest and shipping and pesticides and land use and uh, all those kinds of things are not great for the environment, let alone the impact of ethanol once it hits gas tanks and is actually mixed into the fuel. It is not considered a good form of energy for that regard.
Yes, and other than the Iowa caucuses, I have a feeling the ethanol policy would have long since been repealed. So
Yeah, exactly. And we don't have Iowa caucuses here in New Mexico. It's hard to see companies as they do for California, where you have, one out of every 8 American living in California. New Mexico and even Oregon combined are not particularly huge states. I don't know if the bill will reflect Oregon and try to somehow piggyback off of them. I just suspect this is going to be a very painful and not effective policy when it comes to the environmental goals. And with that, we will leave the program there. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.